This is the story of Adrian Cole and his wife Victoria Cole. Their marriage had the appearance of something carefully constructed, a house built to be admired from the street, with rooms inside that no one fully understood, not even the people living in them. Victoria had loved Adrian in the way that some women love men, who seem to need nothing, fiercely, and with a quiet desperation to be necessary. Adrian had chosen her for reasons he told himself were simple: her intelligence, her composure, the way she never asked him for more than he was willing to give. What neither of them examined closely enough was the architecture of the thing, the load-bearing walls, the places where the foundation had never quite set. The unraveling, when it came, would not announce itself. It would simply become visible the way a crack does, not in the moment it forms, but in the morning light, when you happen to look. The house on Fernwood Drive had a particular quality in the early evenings, when the light came through the west-facing windows at a low angle and turned everything amber. Victoria had always loved that hour. She would make tea. She didn't always finish and sit at the kitchen island with a book open in front of her. And sometimes Adrian would come in from his home office and stand at the refrigerator for a moment, not really looking for anything, and then go back the way he came. It was domestic. It was comfortable. It was, she had told herself for years, enough. They had been married for 7 years when she first started noticing the quality of his silences. Not that Adrian had ever been a talkative man. That was part of what had drawn her to him initially. He was measured, contained, the kind of person who chose words the way other people chose furniture, carefully, with an eye toward how things would look over time. But there is a difference between a man who is quiet because he is thinking and a man who is quiet because he has decided you are not worth speaking to. Victoria was only beginning to understand. That autumn, which kind she had married, his friends occupied a particular stratum of the city's social world, the kind of men who had gone to the right schools not because their families were old money, but because their families had understood early that money needed the right kind of company to grow. Marcus Webb was the one she liked least, though she had never been able to articulate exactly why. He had a way of looking at her that was too attentive, too carefully calibrated, as if he were studying rather than seeing. Daniel Fry was easier, louder, more obviously self-satisfied, the kind of man who made his own shallowness comfortable by making everyone laugh at it. Then there was Oliver Strand, who was quieter than the others and watched everything with the mild expression of someone keeping score. They came to dinner on a Thursday in October, the 4 of them, the way they did every few months. Victoria had made something complicated, because she always made something complicated when they came, a habit she recognized as a form of performance and couldn't quite stop. Adrian opened wine. The conversation moved the way it always did. Business, travel, the shortcomings of mutual acquaintances. And Victoria sat at the end of the table and participated just enough to be present without being central. It was during dessert that Marcus said something she almost let pass. He had been talking about a colleague of his, a woman, apparently, who had made a poor investment decision and was now in the process of recovering from it. She should have known, he said, in a tone that wasn't quite contemptuous but was adjacent to it. The information was there, she just didn't want to see it. Adrian said nothing. He turned his wine glass slightly on the tablecloth. Oliver smiled at something across the room. Victoria looked at Marcus and said pleasantly, or maybe she trusted the people who were supposed to be honest with her. There was a small pause. Not uncomfortable, exactly. More like the kind of pause that follows a remark when everyone in the room has understood it differently. "That's generous," Marcus said and smiled. Adrian refilled his glass. Later, after the guests had gone and she was washing the good dishes because she didn't trust them to the machine, Adrian stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his jacket still on and said, "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know," she said. He stood there a moment longer, as if something else were coming. Then he said goodnight and went upstairs, and Victoria stood at the sink with her hands in the warm water and looked at the window above it, which at that hour showed only her own reflection and the dark beyond. She thought something is wrong, not loudly, not as a revelation, more the way you might think it about a tooth that has begun to ache, acknowledging the fact without yet being willing to do anything about it. She finished the dishes. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed beside a man who was already sleeping. or pretending to, and she lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, which it did, the way old houses do, with small sounds that can mean anything. By February, she had stopped telling him about her days. It wasn't a decision she'd made consciously. It happened the way most erosions happen, gradually and then all at once, so that by the time you notice the shoreline has moved, you can no longer remember exactly where it used to be. She would come home from the architecture firm where she worked and make dinner, and they would eat together at the kitchen island because the dining room felt somehow too formal for just two people. And he would scroll through something on his phone while she talked about a client meeting or a zoning dispute, and after a few weeks she noticed that she had simply stopped narrating, stopped filling the silence with the texture of her life. He didn't notice, which told her something. She tried to be fair about it. Adrian was under pressure at work. The investment group he'd built with Marcus and the others had taken on a complicated portfolio, and there were, apparently, difficulties she was never quite given the specifics of. She had learned early in their marriage that his professional life was a country with a closed border. He would tell her the broad outlines and leave the interior unmapped, and she had accepted this as the cost of being with a man who valued his own separateness. What she hadn't anticipated was that the separateness would expand. She had lunch with her friend Diane on a Wednesday, and Diane asked how things were at home, and Victoria said, "Fine," and then looked at her water glass and said, "I think we've just gotten into a rhythm that doesn't leave much room for anything else." Diane, who had been divorced twice and had the particular clarity of someone who had already survived her own mistakes, said, "What kind of rhythm?" "The kind where everything functions," Victoria said. "Nothing breaks. Nothing needs attention. It's very..." She searched for the word, efficient. "That sounds terrible." "It isn't, I don't think. I just..." She stopped. Diane looked at her. "What?" "I don't know who he's thinking about," Victoria said. "When he's quiet. I used to know. Or I thought I did." She believed at the time that this was a problem of intimacy, the slow recession of two people from each other, ordinary and sad and recoverable if they chose to recover it. She did not yet have the information that would reframe it. That came on a Saturday morning in late February, unremarkably. She was looking for a phone charger in the drawer of his desk. He was out. She'd asked by text and he'd said yes, go ahead. And the charger wasn't there, but a folded piece of paper was. Tucked beneath a leather portfolio she recognized from a weekend trip they'd taken 2 years ago. She didn't read it immediately. She stood there and looked at it and thought, "I should put this back," she thought. There is no reason to read someone else's private correspondence. She thought, he said go ahead. She unfolded it. It was handwritten, which was unusual enough to be notable. The handwriting was Marcus Webb's. She recognized it from birthday cards, from dinner invitations, from a note he'd sent after her father's funeral that she had found, at the time, oddly warm. The letter was brief. It was not a confession of anything, not in any explicit sense. It referenced something called the arrangement, and it referenced Victoria by name twice. And it said, in the second to last line, "She's playing her part better than we anticipated. You should be pleased." Victoria read it twice. Then she folded it exactly as she had found it, placed it beneath the leather portfolio, and closed the desk drawer. She stood in the middle of her husband's office for a while. The house was very quiet. Outside, someone somewhere was using a leaf blower, and the sound was very distant and very ordinary. She felt, she would think later, almost nothing at first. A kind of suspension, the feeling you get in the moment between stepping off a curb and understanding that the ground is lower than you thought. Not fear yet, just the recalibration of space. She walked to the kitchen and made coffee she didn't want and sat at the island and thought carefully. And then, still sitting there, she looked up from her coffee cup toward the window, toward the amber quality of even this winter light, and said, quietly and to no one in particular, "I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something." She blinked. The leaf blower continued outside. The coffee cooled in its cup. She looked back down, and the sensation of having spoken to something vast and invisible passed like a small weather system, strange and unaccountable. and she let it go. She had more important things to think about. She waited 3 weeks, not because she was afraid, and not because she was uncertain about what she'd read. She waited because she had decided, somewhere in the still, considering part of herself that Adrian had perhaps underestimated, that she wanted to understand before she spoke. Understanding, she had always believed, was more useful than reaction. She began paying attention differently. Not dramatically. She didn't go through his phone or follow him anywhere. She simply started listening to the spaces in their conversations where information was being withheld, and she started cataloging the moments when Adrian's carefully maintained neutrality slipped, very slightly, into something that looked like performance. He was performing being a husband. She saw it now. The coffee he brought her on weekend mornings, the occasional question about her work that was just detailed enough to seem genuine, the way he touched her shoulder when they were at parties, a gesture that read as affection from the outside and felt, up close, like punctuation. She thought about the word arrangement. She thought about the phrase playing her part. She thought about Marcus Webb watching her across dinner tables for 7 years with that too careful attention, and Oliver Strand keeping score of something she'd never been told the rules of. And she thought, what kind of men do this? Not as a question, as a categorization. She confronted Adrian on a Tuesday evening, which she chose deliberately because it was the most ordinary day of the week. No occasion, no significance. Nothing he could attribute the conversation to except her own readiness. She made dinner. They ate. She waited until he had carried his plate to the sink, and then she said, still at the table, "I found the letter from Marcus." He turned around slowly, not with the startled guilt of a man caught in something simple, with something more considered, which told her the thing she most needed to know. He had always known this was possible. He had assessed the risk and decided it was acceptable. "Victoria," he said, "you don't have to explain it," she said. "I've mostly understood it." He came back to the table and sat down across from her, and she noticed that he didn't look ashamed. He looked very slightly relieved, which was in its own way the most clarifying thing he could have done. "It wasn't," he started. "Wasn't what?" He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to defend it," she said. "I'm asking you to be honest with me. Once. Just this once." He looked at the table. At his hands. He said, we've been doing this for years, before I met you. It started as something else, and it became a game." He didn't deny it. "What was the game?" she asked. Her voice was very even. She was proud of that, in a distant way. He explained it haltingly. A series of long-term social experiments was how he put it, as if the clinical language would soften the architecture of the thing. The group would identify women, or sometimes men, though less often, in particular circumstances, and construct situations designed to test specific behaviors. Loyalty, resilience, the capacity for self-deception. They documented outcomes. There had been, over the years, a kind of informal record-keeping. She had been, apparently, one of their more interesting subjects. "What made me interesting?" she asked. He looked up then, and she saw in his face something she hadn't expected, genuine complication. Not remorse, not exactly. Something more like a man who has built a machine and is only now understanding what it was built to do. "You never did what we expected," he said. She absorbed this. "I want a divorce," she said. "I'll find a lawyer this week." He nodded slowly, and she thought he expected this too. She thought he has already prepared for this. She thought he is still running the experiment. "Okay," he said. "And Adrian." She stood and collected her glass from the table. "I'd like you to understand something." He waited. "I'm not angry," she said. "I want you to sit with that." The divorce took 8 months. It was not acrimonious in the legal sense. They divided things with a fairness that their lawyers seemed faintly surprised by, as if they had expected the ugliness that usually lives in the machinery of these proceedings and had come prepared for a war that failed to materialize. Victoria kept the house on Fernwood Drive for 3 months and then sold it because she found that the amber light in the evenings had begun to mean something different than it used to, and she did not want to spend years revising its meaning. She moved to a smaller apartment in the west end of the city, with tall windows and a view of a park, and she found that she liked it there with a thoroughness that surprised her. She did not tell people what had happened. Not the whole of it, not at first. She told Diane, who listened in a particular silence and then said, "What are you going to do?" And Victoria said, "I'm figuring that out." What she was figuring out, in fact, was the documentation. She had spent the months of the divorce proceedings doing something Adrian had underestimated. She had been learning. She reached out, carefully, to a woman named Sasha, someone she'd met briefly at a fundraising event 2 years ago, who worked in civil litigation. Sasha had a quality Victoria recognized and valued. She was interested in precision. They met for coffee twice, and then they met with Sasha's firm, and Victoria laid out what she knew in the even, careful way she had learned to present architectural proposals. Here is what exists. Here is the structure of the problem. Here is what I am asking for. She had kept photographs of the letter. She had also, and this was the part Adrian had not anticipated, because he had not in the end correctly measured her, spent the previous year making a quiet record, not obsessively, not with the frantic energy of someone gathering ammunition. Systematically, the way you document a project that matters, dates, conversations, behavioral patterns, names. She had even found, through a contact she'd made at the firm and would not name, that she was not the first woman associated with Adrian's circle to have felt this particular wrongness without being able to name it. There were 3 others, as it turned out. The legal path was not fast and was not guaranteed, but it existed, and Victoria walked it with the composure of someone who has made peace with uncertainty. The civil case was filed quietly. The social reckoning happened somewhat differently, less controlled, more human. When one of the other women, a person named Claire, who had been involved with Oliver Strand, gave an interview to a journalist she trusted. And the story ran in the kind of publication that people like Adrian and Marcus and Oliver read over breakfast and had always assumed would never concern them. Adrian called her the morning the story ran. She let it go to voicemail. He said, "I don't expect you to... I just wanted to say that I know this is partly because of how I handled." A long pause. "I'm sorry?" She listened to it once, sitting at the tall windows with her coffee, looking at the park below where a dog was chasing something through the frost-stiffened grass. She thought the apology was real. She thought it was also insufficient in a way that wasn't really his fault. Some debts are too structurally complicated to be discharged with a single word. She did not call back. What she noticed in herself over these months was not the triumph she might have anticipated. It was something quieter. The particular sensation of having been in a story about yourself without knowing it, and the slow process of becoming the author again. She was not defined by what had been done to her. She had known this in the abstract for years. She was learning it, now, in a different register. She still made tea. She didn't always finish. She still read books at windows. Some things about a person persist through every revision. She saw Adrian once more, almost a year after the divorce was final. It was accidental, in the way that encounters in a city of this size are always both accidental and inevitable. She was leaving a restaurant on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of early autumn day that has summer still in it. The air light and specific, the trees not yet turned. He was coming from the direction of the park across the street, and they saw each other from perhaps half a block away. And there was that particular beat, a fraction of a second, when 2 people recognize each other and decide simultaneously how to behave. They met in the middle of the sidewalk, slightly to the side to let people pass. He looked well, tired around the eyes in a way she recognized. Not the tiredness of overwork, but of something ongoing and interior. He had lost a little weight. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize. "Victoria," he said. "Adrian." there was a moment of the ordinary awkwardness, the negotiation of two people who have shared an enormous amount of space and no longer share any. She had expected, she realized, to feel more, not pain exactly and not anger. She had moved well beyond both of those. She had expected something larger. What she felt instead was the particular weight of knowing a person deeply and being no longer part of their life. The compound, irreducible sadness of that, which has nothing to do with regret and everything to do with time. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," she said, and meant it. Genuinely. He looked at her in a way he rarely had during their marriage, without the film of performance, without the careful management of disclosure. Just looking. "The case," he started. "I don't need to talk about that." "No, I know." He paused. "I wasn't going to relitigate it. I was going to say that I think what you did was..." He stopped, and she could see him choosing words the way he always had, carefully, with an eye toward durability. "I think you were right to do it." She considered this. "I know you do," she said. "I think you knew I was right before I did it." He didn't disagree. A couple passed between them, laughing about something, and both of them stepped slightly to accommodate the moment, and then the couple was gone and the sidewalk was quiet again. "I've been thinking," Adrian said, and then stopped. She waited. "I've been thinking about what I was actually trying to measure," he said. "In all of it, I've been trying to work out whether I was genuinely curious about people, or whether I was just..." He looked at the pavement for a moment. Afraid of them. She thought this was probably the most honest thing he had ever said to her. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think the latter," he said. "Mostly." She nodded slowly. She thought about 7 years in the amber light of the Fernwood house. She thought about the way he had stood in doorways, not quite entering rooms. She thought about a man who had designed a life around observation rather than participation, and called it intelligence, when it was, at its core, a form of distance. "I hope you find something better to do with it," she said, not warmly, not coldly, with the level care of someone who has thought about a thing long enough to mean it without performing it. He looked at her for a moment longer. She held his gaze, easily, because she had nothing left to prove to him, and he seemed to know it. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." She walked back toward the restaurant to collect her forgotten jacket, and she did not look back. Not because she was afraid of what she might feel, but because there was nothing more to see. The story had ended in the only way honest stories end. Not with victory, not with wreckage, but with two people walking in different directions on an ordinary afternoon, carrying everything they had learned and could not unlearn into whatever came next. The autumn light was very clean. She put her jacket on and walked toward the park.